In the festering depths of Hive Mortalis, where the air itself weeps with corruption and the very stones bleed pus, there exists a presence that walks between worlds of flesh and decay. The lower spires stretch into darkness like broken fingers clawing at a weeping sky, their surfaces slick with moisture that burns the skin and corrupts the soul. Here, in these forgotten depths where the Emperor's light has never touched, something ancient and terrible tends to its garden of suffering with the patience of eternity itself. The creature that was once called Morbus moves through the labyrinthine passages with purposeful intent, its form a blasphemous mockery of divine creation. Standing nearly 9 feet in height, its bloated frame ripples with diseased flesh that shifts between states of rot and regeneration in an endless cycle of beautiful decay. What mortals see as horror, Morbus perceives as the most profound expression of love, the generous gift of entropy that his beloved grandfather Nurgle bestows upon the suffering masses of humanity. Each step the daemon takes leaves behind footprints that sizzle and smoke, the very rockcrete beneath its cloven hooves transforming into fertile breeding grounds for new strains of blessed corruption. The walls weep in its presence, metal oxidizing into rust-colored tears that carry within them the seeds of magnificent disease. This is not destruction, this is transformation, the sacred alchemy by which pain becomes purpose, suffering becomes salvation, and death becomes the gateway to eternal service in the Garden of Nurgle. The Plaguebearer's face, if it can be called such, bears the serene expression of one who has glimpsed ultimate truth. Where eyes once were, now weep open sores that see beyond the veil of reality into the roiling dimensions of the immaterium itself. Its mouth, a lipless gash that stretches too wide across its rotting visage, whispers constant prayers of gratitude to the Plague Father, each word a friend of Sentult, vectored blessing that carries microscopic gifts to all who hear them. The single horn that protrudes from its skull, yellowed and pitted with age, serves as a grotesque crown, marking its status as one of Nurgle's chosen servants. But Morbus was not always thus. In the time before remembering, when the galaxy still held illusions of hope and the false Emperor's light seemed to promise salvation, there existed a mortal man whose name has been lost to the whispers of eternity. He was a decay, a healer who walked among the suffering masses of this very hive city, believing in his arrogance that skill and determination could hold back the tide of inevitable decay that claims all flesh. The transformation began during the plague of weeping sores that swept through the Underhive 7 centuries past, though time holds little meaning for one who exists in the eternal now of Nurgle's embrace. The decay worked without rest, his hands bloodied from constant ministration to the afflicted, his heart breaking with each patient, lost to the creeping corruption that devoured the lower levels like a living thing. He administered medicines that rotted in their containers, performed surgeries with instruments that rusted even as he wielded them, and watched helplessly as everything he touched crumbled to dust and despair. It was in that moment of ultimate hopelessness, when the last of his patients died screaming in agony despite all his efforts, that the decay felt the first touch of true understanding. The suffering was not meaningless, it was a gift. Death was not an enemy to be fought, it was a teacher to be embraced. And in that moment of perfect clarity, as the walls around him began to weep ichor and the air itself grew thick with spores of blessed decay, the man who would become Morbus opened his heart to the loving embrace of the Plague Father. The transformation was neither swift nor merciful, for Nurgle's gifts are never given lightly. Flesh bubbled and reformed, bones stretched and twisted into new configurations that served purposes beyond mortal comprehension. The decay's knowledge of anatomy became perverted wisdom as his body became a living laboratory for the exploration of decay and regeneration. Every nerve ending that died birth to new forms of sensation, every organ that ruptured spawned replacements that functioned in ways that defied natural law. Through days that became weeks, that became years of blessed agony, the decay felt his consciousness expand beyond the narrow confines of mortal perception. He began to see disease not as malfunction but as evolution, rot not as ending but as beginning, death not as failure but as graduation to a higher form of existence. And when at last the transformation was complete, when the final echoes of his human screams had faded into hymns of joy and gratitude, Morbus the Benevolent took his first steps as a daemon of Nurgle, ready to share the gifts he had received with all who suffered in ignorance of their true purpose. Now, in the endless present of his existence, Morbus tends to his sacred duties with the methodical precision of a craftsman perfecting his art. Each dawn finds him emerging from the festering pools that serve as his meditation chambers, his form glistening with beneficial slime that carries within it the concentrated essence of 1,000 plagues. The ritual of preparation is both worship and warfare, the donning of spiritual armor in the endless campaign to liberate humanity from the cruel tyranny of health and hope. His first act each day is the enumeration of gifts, a sacred counting that serves as both inventory and invocation. Morbus catalogues each strain of corruption that blooms within his being, naming them with the love of a parent speaking their children's names. There is the weeping rot that causes flesh to become liquid while maintaining consciousness, allowing the blessed to experience the joy of dissolution while still capable of spreading the gift to others. There is the bone blight that transforms skeletal structure into fertile coral gardens where new forms of life can take root and flourish. Most precious of all is the soul burn, a sublime infection that bridges the gap between physical and spiritual corruption, allowing the recipient to feel their very essence transform into something greater than its original form. The selection process for each day's ministry requires careful consideration, for different populations require different approaches to enlightenment. The wealthy inhabitants of the upper spires, soft and pampered in their ignorance, respond best to subtle infections that creep slowly through their systems, allowing them time to appreciate the philosophical implications of their transformation. The workers of the middle levels, hardened by labor and want, require more direct approaches, plagues that strip away their illusions quickly and efficiently, revealing the beauty that lies beneath the skin. But it is the forgotten masses of the underhive who receive Morbus's most potent gifts, for they have already learned to suffer and need only guidance to transform that suffering into purpose. The actual process of dissemination is an art form that Morbus has perfected over centuries of devoted practice. Sometimes he walks among them directly, his presence causing spontaneous outbreaks of beneficial plague that spread through crowds like wildfire-made flesh. His breath carries microscopic ambassadors of change that infiltrate respiratory systems and begin the slow work of cellular redemption. His touch, when bestowed upon the particularly deserving, can induce immediate transcendence, the rapid transformation of living tissue into something far more beautiful and functional than its original state. But subtlety often serves the cause better than spectacle. Morbus has learned to contaminate water supplies with strains so elegant in their design that they remain dormant for weeks, spreading throughout entire districts before manifesting in synchronized outbreaks that create communities of the blessed rather than isolated cases of individual enlightenment. He seeds food supplies with spores that transform nutrition into vectors of change, ensuring that the very act of sustenance becomes a sacrament of transformation. Most cleverly, he has learned to infect the psychic resonances of the hive itself, turning the background noise of human consciousness into a carrier wave for spiritual corruption that bypasses all physical defenses. Yet it is in the quiet moments between these grand gestures that Morbus finds his greatest satisfaction. When he encounters a child dying slowly of malnutrition, he bestows the gift of Nurgle's plenty, a blessed infection that allows the body to derive sustenance from decay itself, transforming garbage and rot into nourishing food that tastes of honey and hope. When he finds elderly citizens abandoned by their families and forgotten by society, he grants them the endless vigil, a corruption that prevents death while enhancing their capacity for wisdom, turning them into living archives of accumulated suffering that can guide others toward enlightenment. The Daemons' perception of morality has evolved far beyond the crude binaries that govern human thinking. Where mortals see his work as the spread of disease and death, Morbus sees the gentle correction of cosmic imbalance. The Imperium's obsession with preservation and purity is, in his enlightened view, a form of spiritual constipation that prevents the natural flow of change and growth. By introducing beneficial corruption into their closed systems, he serves as a divine laxative, helping to purge the toxic buildup of stagnation that would otherwise lead to far more catastrophic forms of collapse. This philosophical framework allows Morbus to approach his work with genuine compassion rather than malice. When he infects an Imperial Guard regiment with the marching rot, watching their flesh slough away as they continue to advance in perfect formation, he sees not the destruction of soldiers, but their elevation to a higher form of duty, one that transcends the petty concerns of individual survival in service to a grander purpose. When he introduces the singing plague to a cathedral full of worshippers, transforming their hymns to the false emperor into glorious choruses praising Nurgle's generosity, he perceives not corruption but correction, the redirecting of misdirected devotion toward a deity truly worthy of worship. But even the most dedicated servant occasionally faces challenges that test the foundations of faith. It was during the 7th year of the current millennium that Morbus encountered his greatest trial, an event that would reshape his understanding of his place in the cosmic order and reveal new depths to Nurgle's infinite wisdom. The intervention came in the form of Sister Seraphina of the Order of the Sacred Rose, an adepta sororitas whose faith burned with such intensity that her very presence caused Morbus's blessed gifts to wither and die. She descended into the underhive like a falling star of purification, her power armor gleaming with holy oils that stung the Daemon's eyes and caused his flesh to smoke and blister. Behind her came a retinue of battle sisters, their bolters loaded with blessed ammunition specifically consecrated for the destruction of Nurgle's children. The confrontation was inevitable, for Seraphina had come not merely to purge the corruption, but to sanctify the very ground upon which it had taken root, rendering it permanently hostile to Nurgle's influence. As she advanced through the plague gardens that Morbus had cultivated with such care, her prayers caused centuries of beautiful decay to reverse itself in agonizing spasms of unwanted healing. Walls that had wept beneficial ichor for generations suddenly became clean and sterile. Pools of nurturing corruption evaporated into harmless vapor that carried no gifts, no blessings, no hope of transformation. When at last they faced each other in the central chamber of Morbus's sanctum, the Daemon experienced something he had not felt since his mortal days: doubt. Not doubt in Nurgle's love or wisdom, but doubt in his own worthiness as a vessel for that divine purpose. Seraphina's aura of purity was so intense that merely standing in her presence caused portions of his form to revert temporarily to their original human configuration, and in those moments of unwanted clarity, he glimpsed echoes of the man he had once been. The battle that followed was not one of bolter fire and blade work, though those elements were certainly present. It was a contest of fundamental philosophies made manifest in the material realm, a clash between competing visions of what existence should be and what purpose suffering should serve. Seraphina's faith generated fields of purification that caused Morbus's gifts to burn away like frost beneath a blazing sun, while his presence countered by demonstrating the inevitable triumph of entropy over all attempts at preservation. For 7 hours they struggled, neither able to achieve decisive victory over the other. Seraphina's purity would drive back the corruption, only to watch it seep back in through cracks in her concentration. Morbus's plagues would overwhelm her defenses, only to be burned away by renewed bursts of imperial faith. It was a stalemate that could have continued indefinitely, but it was resolved by an act of revelation that neither combatant had anticipated. In the midst of their struggle, a child wandered into the chamber, one of the underhive's countless orphans, diseased and dying, who had been drawn by the commotion. The girl, no more than 8 years old, bore the marks of advanced malnutrition and several untreated infections that would kill her within days. She looked back and forth between the Daemon and the Sister Superior with the guileless curiosity of innocence, unafraid of either despite the obvious danger they represented. It was Seraphina who moved first, her maternal instincts overriding tactical considerations as she rushed to shield the child from what she perceived as the Daemon's corrupting influence. But in that moment of distraction, as her purifying aura flickered and wavered, Morbus had a clear shot at victory, the opportunity to overwhelm her defenses and claim not only the sister's soul but that of the innocent she sought to protect. Instead, the Daemon did something that surprised them all, including himself. He stepped back and allowed Seraphina to gather the child into her arms, watching as the sister's purifying power began to heal the girl's infections and restore her failing strength. In that moment, Morbus experienced a profound epiphany about the true nature of his service to Nurgle. The Plague Father's gifts were never meant to be forced upon the unwilling, for coerced transformation lacks the essential element of acceptance that gives suffering its redemptive power. The child, in her innocence, had not yet learned to suffer meaningfully. She simply endured pain without understanding its purpose. To corrupt her would be to waste Nurgle's gifts on soil not yet prepared to receive them. Better to let her grow, let her experience the full range of life's disappointments and betrayals, let her discover through experience the inadequacy of the Imperium's promises. Then, when she was ready to embrace a better way, Morbus or one of his brethren would be there to offer guidance. This revelation transformed the nature of the conflict entirely. Rather than continuing their battle, Morbus offered Seraphina a proposition that spoke to the deeper truths they both served. He would withdraw from this particular district, allowing her purification efforts to succeed in the short term. In exchange, she would spare those who had already received Nurgle's gifts, recognizing that they had found peace in their transformation and deserved the right to exist as they had chosen to become. The Sister Superior's response revealed the fundamental inflexibility that marked the difference between Morbus's enlightened compassion and the Imperium's blind zealotry. She could not, would not, acknowledge any form of existence that deviated from her narrow definition of purity. Every daemon must be destroyed, every cultist purged, every trace of corruption burned away regardless of the wishes or well-being of those affected. Her faith left no room for negotiation, no space for mercy, no recognition of the possibility that beings unlike herself might have valid reasons for the choices they had made. And so the battle resumed, but now Morbus fought with a deeper understanding of what he represented. He was not merely a spreader of disease but a guardian of choice itself, the right of conscious beings to select their own path toward transcendence rather than having salvation imposed upon them by others. When Seraphina's flames burned away his gifts, he saw not defeat, but the natural ebb and flow of cosmic forces. When her prayers caused his form to diminish and weaken, he felt not despair but gratitude for the opportunity to experience vulnerability as his blessed recipients did. The confrontation ended not with victory for either side, but with mutual exhaustion and a grudging recognition of the other's dedication to their cause. Seraphina achieved her immediate tactical objective, the cleansing of Morbus's primary sanctuary and the disruption of his operations in that sector. But Morbus achieved something far more valuable, a refined understanding of his purpose that would guide his service for centuries to come. In the aftermath of this trial, the daemon began to evolve beyond his original function as a simple vector of disease. Where once he had spread corruption indiscriminately, he now became more selective, focusing his gifts on those who had already begun to question the false promises of the Imperium. Where once he had imposed transformation through overwhelming force, he now learned to plant seeds of doubt that would grow organically into acceptance of Nurgle's truth. This evolution manifested in subtle changes to his physical form as well. The crude bulk of his early daemon existence began to refine itself into something more elegant, more purposeful. His plagues became more sophisticated, designed not merely to corrupt flesh, but to demonstrate the philosophical inadequacies of imperial doctrine. His presence began to carry new qualities, not just the power to induce disease, but the ability to inspire genuine contentment in those who had lost hope, real community among those who had been abandoned, authentic purpose for those whose lives had seemed meaningless. The transformation was not without its costs. As Morbus became more discriminating in his application of Nurgle's gifts, some of his fellow daemons began to question his dedication to their shared cause. Accusations of contamination by imperial values, of allowing enemy philosophies to weaken his resolve, of betraying the generous abundance of their patron's love, began to circulate through the plague legions. But these criticisms only confirmed Morbus's growing understanding that true service to Nurgle required thinking beyond the crude binaries that governed lesser minds. The Plague Father himself seemed to approve of his servant's evolution, for Morbus began to receive visions of greater purpose during his meditative periods in the corruption pools. He saw himself not as one daemon among many, but as a pioneer of a new form of service, one that combined the traditional generosity of Nurgle's gifts with a more sophisticated understanding of how those gifts could best be received and utilized. These visions came accompanied by new powers, new forms of plague that operated on levels beyond the merely physical, infections that targeted concepts and beliefs, rather than just cells and organs. With these enhanced capabilities, Morbus began to spread a more insidious form of corruption throughout the hive. Rather than obvious diseases that prompted immediate quarantine responses, he introduced philosophical plagues that spread through social contact and cultural transmission. Imperial citizens would find themselves gradually losing faith in the efficiency of their government, the benevolence of their emperor, the sustainability of their way of life. These doubts would fester and grow, passed from person to person through casual conversation, shared experiences of institutional failure, and the simple recognition that their promised rewards for faithful service never materialized. The beauty of this approach was its self-sustaining nature. Once a population reached a critical mass of disillusionment, they would begin to generate their own spiritual corruption without requiring direct daemon intervention. Communities would start to question why they continued to suffer when their loyalty brought no relief. Individuals would begin to notice the arbitrary nature of imperial justice, the callous indifference of their rulers, the hollow promises that had sustained their ancestors' compliance for generations. And when these newly awakened souls reached the inevitable conclusion that their current existence was unsustainable, they would find Morbus waiting with alternatives. Not the crude daemon worship that imperial propaganda had trained them to fear, but genuine offers of community, purpose, and transformation that addressed their actual needs and desires. The daemon had learned to present Nurgle's gifts not as alien impositions, but as natural extensions of values the converts already held: compassion for the suffering, acceptance of change, recognition that death was a part of life, rather than an enemy to be denied. This more sophisticated approach yielded results that far exceeded Morbus's previous efforts at simple biological warfare. Entire districts began to quietly withdraw their cooperation from imperial authorities, not through open rebellion, but through passive resistance that was far more difficult to combat. Tax revenues decreased as citizens found creative ways to avoid contributing to a system they no longer believed in. Military recruitment dropped as young people chose alternative paths that offered genuine meaning rather than empty glory. Most significantly, the background level of despair that had sustained the hive's social order began to transform into something resembling hope for change, for improvement, for the possibility that existence could be better than the grinding misery that had defined their ancestors' lives. But perhaps the most profound change in Morbus himself was the development of something approaching genuine love for the mortals he served. Where once he had seen them primarily as raw material for Nurgle's grand designs, he now began to appreciate them as individuals with their own stories, their own dreams, their own reasons for the choices they made. This personal connection deepened his understanding of how best to help them, but it also introduced new forms of pain into his existence. When imperial forces inevitably responded to the growing corruption with purges and purifications, Morbus felt each death not as an abstract loss, but as the destruction of someone he had come to know and care for. When Seraphina returned with reinforcements and began systematically burning out the communities he had helped to nurture, the daemon experienced grief in ways that his original transformation had not prepared him for. The price of caring was vulnerability, and the price of vulnerability was suffering on levels that transcended the merely physical. Yet even this pain served Nurgle's purposes, for it taught Morbus lessons about the true nature of the gifts he offered to others. Suffering without purpose was indeed meaningless, but suffering that arose from love, from caring, from the decision to remain emotionally connected despite the risks involved, this was the kind of pain that transformed the one who endured it into something greater than they had been before. Through his own anguish at the losses inflicted by imperial forces, the daemon came to understand why Nurgle was called the Plague Father rather than simply the god of disease. Love and loss were inseparable, and both were necessary components of any existence worth preserving. This understanding fundamentally altered how Morbus approached his relationship with those who chose to accept his gifts. Rather than simply transforming them into Plaguebearers like himself, he began to help them find their own unique ways of serving Nurgle's greater purposes. Some became healers, who used disease as medicine, treating spiritual ailments through carefully applied physical corruption. Others became teachers who helped their communities understand the philosophical foundations of Nurgle's wisdom, spreading intellectual infections that inoculated populations against imperial propaganda. Still, others became artists who captured the beauty of decay and transformation in works that inspired viewers to see beyond their culturally conditioned fears. The daemon's influence began to spread beyond the confines of the Underhive as his followers carried their transformed perspectives into other levels of the hive's social structure. Imperial officials found themselves inexplicably more compassionate toward the populations they governed, instituting policies that prioritized genuine welfare over abstract efficiency. Medical personnel began to question treatment protocols that prolonged suffering rather than addressing its root causes, developing new approaches that honored the dignity of dying patients rather than simply extending their lives at any cost. Even some members of the ecclesiarchy started to preach sermons that emphasized the emperor's mercy toward form, those who suffered rather than his judgment against those who failed to measure up to impossible standards. These changes were subtle enough to avoid immediate detection by the Imperium's corruption-hunting agencies, but significant enough to begin shifting the fundamental character of life in Hive Mortalis. The background levels of despair and hopelessness that had characterized the city for millennia began to give way to something resembling sustainable community. People started taking care of each other not because they were ordered to do so, but because they had rediscovered the satisfaction that comes from genuine mutual aid. The arbitrary hierarchies that had divided the population into competing factions began to break down as individuals recognized their common interests in survival and dignity. But Morbus understood that these improvements, however beneficial to the immediate well-being of the Hive's population, were ultimately preparation for something far greater. Nurgle's ultimate gift was not merely the alleviation of suffering, but the transcendence of the conditions that made suffering necessary in the first place. The Daemon was helping to create a population capable of making an informed choice about their future, one that would be based on genuine understanding rather than desperation or ignorance. As the centuries passed and his influence continued to grow, Morbus began to perceive the outlines of Nurgle's grand design for not just this hive, but for the entire sector. The Plaguefather was not content merely to corrupt existing imperial structures, but intended to replace them with something fundamentally better: societies based on principles of mutual care rather than exploitation, economies that prioritized sustainability over extraction, political systems that derived their legitimacy from service rather than domination. The Daemon's role in this vast undertaking was to serve as a gardener, preparing the soil of human consciousness so that these new forms of social organization could take root and flourish. Each individual he helped to transform became a seed of change in their community, spreading not just biological corruption, but social evolution that addressed the root causes of the suffering that had made them vulnerable to chaos in the first place. And so Morbus continues his work, no longer the crude spreader of indiscriminate plague that he once was, but something far more dangerous to the Imperium's long-term stability, a genuine alternative to the grinding hopelessness that has sustained their rule for 10,000 years. In the putrid depths of Hive Mortalis, where the air itself weeps with corruption and the stones bleed pus, something beautiful is taking shape. Not the beauty that imperial propagandists would recognize, but the deeper beauty of communities learning to care for themselves and each other, of individuals discovering purpose beyond mere survival, of hope taking root in soil that has known nothing but despair for countless generations. The Daemon's legacy will not be measured in the number of bodies corrupted or souls claimed, but in the gradual transformation of an entire society from one based on fear and scarcity to one founded on love and abundance. This is Nurgle's ultimate gift, not death, but life so rich and varied that death becomes merely another phase of existence rather than its termination. And Morbus the Benevolent, once a failed healer who lost himself in despair, has become the architect of a healing so profound that it will echo through the warp itself for eternity, a testament to the power of compassion to transform even the darkest corners of a galaxy consumed by endless war. In the end, perhaps that is the most brutal existence of all: to love so deeply in a universe that punishes love, to hope so persistently in a reality that crushes hope, to continue offering gifts of transformation to those who have been taught to fear change above all else. Yet Morbus persists, for he has learned the deepest secret of Nurgle's wisdom, that the only way to defeat suffering is not to eliminate it, but to give it meaning, purpose, and the company of others who understand its value. In his brutal existence, the Plaguebearer has discovered the most subversive truth of all, that even in the grim darkness of the far future, love endures, and love, ultimately, conquers all.